Good day, my fellow Americans and good people of the world. Today I would like to address you in regards to setting a precedence for eudaimonia in politics. Eudaimonia is essentially the concept of being well. And my objective is to create an orientation by which America can align with itself along the lines of mutualism for mutual interests, mutual benefits, mutual securities, mutual respects. And this is in order for us to be in a sense of agreement with one another how we are going to move forward in a direction that is conducive to our well-being. And the ideal is to establish this sense of American identity that is represented by the concept of welfaring stewardship. And this I have talked about many times before, but to sum it up here succinctly is to say that I want America to work for everyone. I want this to happen without the disadvantage of anyone. I want it so that nobody gets left behind, and I want to make sure that nobody gets kept behind. And I want to make sure that everybody lives the good life. And this is something that I believe is very much in the realm of possibilities. It's just a matter of us choosing for ourselves, like this is what we want to do. And given all the options that are available right now, considering our historical reference, our situational reference, and our find reference, the way things are going right now is not really suited to work out for everybody's collective best interest. There's always somebody who is left on the dirty end of the stick, so to speak, and I'm not okay with these outcomes. They were completely avoidable, but unfortunately, when you have people in positions of decision making that are very self-centered, they're not looking to what's going to happen to other people when they make those decisions. They just become narrowly focused and they're not considering others, and so they just go ahead and do what they do, and then everybody's just got to deal with it, in the aftermath. The situation that we find ourselves in right now is one that says our past and prior decision making has led us to a point where America is now facing another war. And it's unfortunate because I don't want anybody to have to go and risk life or limb to, follow the orders of the commander-in-chief, who is not even being respectful enough of the fact that they're the ones, giving the orders that other people are going to have to then enact. And the consequences may not be able to go directly back to, the decision maker, but the one person that's supposed to be taking extreme ownership of this is the person who made the decisions. But in the fallout and aftermath, it's, everybody who's suffering a consequence in their own way. Depending on how close you are in proximity to the epicenter of the, point where shit hit the fan. And it's unfortunate that our military service members are now in this really precarious situation, and they don't know what's going on. They don't really know what they're doing other than, point and shoot in this general direction and, hit a target and just keep doing that until we tell you you don't have to do that anymore. And that's not really a mission objective. It's just kind of go in and do things until we say that you're done. And that does instill a lot of confidence for our members of the military, because you think along the chain of command, people from every level of the chain of command need to understand what is the point of the exercise. What are we doing this for? What's this about? And if they don't understand that, how are they going to be able to communicate to people other than this, point and shoot type directive? And then when somebody is giving a point and shoot directive, and then you have outcome consequences such as a girl's school getting shot, and then, well over 100 children are taken out in an instant, well, now that's a conscience thing that the person or persons who were involved in the, execution of that order now have a conscience that they have to burden carry, and it's much harder for them to reconcile that in their head if they don't have some sense of like, I'm doing this for country, I'm doing this, for, service to protect the global order, I'm doing this, for something that matters, And so now these people are left with this responsibility of a burden that they have to carry. And, regardless of whether, it's done in some autonomous fashion, somebody had to give the orders for that to happen. And, the ultimate responsibility should be taken by the commander-in-chief, because that takes the burden away from the individuals who were just following orders. It may not take away the responsibility from them in the sense of, is this, a violation of international law and wartime laws, rules of engagement, these sorts of things, but in the sense of the conscious guilt that these persons who were following those orders must now endure. The burden would be lessened if the person in charge, the commander-in-chief, assumed, and took extreme ownership of it. And, of course, we're not seeing that happen. And, every person along the chain of command is now in this precarious position of, well, none of them can really take extreme ownership because ultimately the buck stops with the commander-in-chief. And so now everybody is in this like terrible, guilt-ridden, dirty conscience, kind of situation, and we're all taking on some really bad karma. And that is going to play out in a sense of, I understand that in the global order and as things are, Iran is not exactly our best friend, and they do pose a threat to America, and they are very hostile towards us. But going over there and kicking up sand and stirring up trouble and taking the lives of children, from what I've heard is potentially even the children of, some of these military leaders, I mean, you're just making matters worse in that regard because, in the grieving process, there's going to be a point when they get to anger, and, these don't seem like people that have the intent to go through the full measured moral, reconciliation of the grieving process to the point where they can get to acceptance and everything is okay because they're okay, to the point where they wouldn't need to retaliate. I think they're just going to get hard stuck on anger. And then they're going to want to retaliate. And now we just have this whole like beehive that's been poked, and it's caused so many more uncontrollable variables of hostilities that are in the minds of these people who are thinking about America as being this aggressive, external force that's coming into their home space, causing them problems, deceiving them to think that, everything was on the up and up. We're trying to find a peaceful accord towards, resolving our differences in regards to, nuclear, proliferation, and trying to stem that and, help to, keep Iran from, using its full capacity of force to, in its worst tendencies to do bad things that could cause harm to others. Instead of finding a way to what would have been and what still ultimately is in the best interest of everybody, is to reconcile and to do what we can to incentivize a path from Iran leaning away from Russia. And because when you get those two forces of people who are not necessarily inclined to do the right thing, as a natural default mode, You don't want them to, concentrate their power and then feed off of each other. It's like, it's important who you surround yourself with, because outcomes in your behaviors will be moderated by those to which you involve yourself with most often. And so, it would have been in America's best interest to just, kind of set a stage of potentials up to gradually over time build up an intentional pathway by which Iran could have moved out of alignment with Russia, and set it up for the opportunity to in time find a way to not be as an aggressive, hostile force, but just a very proud and distinguished, superpower in its own right. And for them to not have the tendency to want to lean towards, the use of violence and terror as a means to advance its agenda or to assert itself and these sorts of things. Because then that kind of like distorts their reality, and they're just in this self-reinforcing schema of, cyclical conflict. And, I'm not being optimistically naive here. I totally understand the situation. Like, I'm sure there are people out there that, like, you have no idea what you're talking about because, Iran is this, like, great threat or whatever. I get it. I understand that. In every measure of the terms, I get it. But for me, I refuse to accept that as our fate. I would prefer to see the potential in everything and everybody for goodness, and that given the right welcoming situation to thrive on, that they would naturally over time be more inclined to move in those directions, and that it becomes a kind of self-reinforcing positive evolution of them coming to terms with how to leave the past behind so they can embrace a better future, and for that to be offered and welcomed to them in a context where it's not constantly looking at them as being a problem to solve or an enemy to face off on, or somebody that has to be controlled or dominated or whatever, but more into the invite of like self-actualization and self-determination, but under the terms and conditions we're all in this together, and we can't be screwing people over, screwing each other over, that sort of thing. And again, I know it sounds optimistically naive, but I can't turn away from the sense of this optimistic belief that we have the capacity to move out of these negative paradigms into more positive ones. But certainly we're not going to get there if we're constantly involving ourselves with, this reinforcement of negative outcome consequences in terms of choosing to do the wrong thing and choosing to, harm others, because that's not going to end up with any good outcomes. It is impossible to establish peaceful accord if you're constantly turning towards warring with people and using violence. It's the simple truth. Violence is not the answer. Love is. And I can see the people of Iran as full of potential for good, and that it's not going to be an overnight, everything's fine, let's hold hands and kumbaya, but there is a realistic path to peace, and it's going to take a welcoming situation that they know that they can thrive on, and in such a way that respects and honors everything that has made them who they are today, in such a way of accepting that that doesn't prevent you from making better decisions. Wake up tomorrow and make different decisions and work towards making a better world together, And so I will constantly center myself on that belief. That does not mean, in some sort of optimistic naivety, that I don't understand the complexity of the situation, that I don't understand the potential for harm, that as if I don't understand, what people are capable of or what they've done in the past. But what I do understand is that this event happening has created so much turmoil in that region. And I mean, it's not like conflict was non-existent, but there's so much turmoil in that region now that wasn't there before. And think of the people. Think of the stability that, these nations, I mean, I understand they're all bundled close together, and there has been long-standing conflicts about borders and belonging and, avenging and, staking claims and, a lot about land grabbing and some sort of sense of historical religiosology that gives them justification to do the things that they do because, someone at one point said that, that's justified. I get all of those dynamics, but all I care about is the people that are now living in a situation where they have to fear for their lives, that stability in the region is not assured, so people are not going to be living their normal lives. They're going to be living in a state of fear, and when that happens, they're in isolation, and then when they're in isolation, guess what the most natural tendency is to default to your most base instinct. And when you've grown up in a situational context to which violence is just normalized, and that you're in a very precarious situation of like domestic order, and then authority is questioned because it seems like it says you're domineering force, and it's like denying you your life and your liberty and your pursuit of happiness, and people want to rail against that because it's like a survival mechanism of wanting to protect yourself and those you love and those things to which are your claim in this world. So there's all these reasons why people want to like stand up, defend, and protect themselves, and then you have forces that are like trying to control the dynamics of so many people who don't really have a coherent alignment with one another, and so you can't assume everybody's going to do the right thing and follow laws and rules of domestic order if left to their own devices. So you have to use these hardline force controls of, this overbearing, dominant, control force of a higher authority. And so you have these, governments that end up taking these hardline stances because they have to be that way in order to control their populations, and to me, it's really sad. It's so sad to see that, because these people are living with the regular, average, everyday people in all of these nations are living in a state of instability and insecurity and fear. And it's bringing out the worst in so many people, and then the best people are harmed, the most. And I just want for a better world and a better life for all of them. And I don't think that, the answer is that America has some, great, savior is going to come in and fix things for these people who have been living long-standing under these, oppressive regimes or these oppressive conditions, or these, desperate situations in which, their economics may not have the stability that's necessary. They're very fragile, even if they are, abundant in resources. We learn today that, it doesn't matter how much oil you have, if you cannot get that where it needs to go, like, you are shut down and you're cut off. And as soon as, that economic, driver for most of these, areas in the Middle East benefit from their rich oil reserves, if they can't get those moving to get to market where they can, reap the benefits of, sharing their resources, things will start to shut down, and, supply chains get cut off, and then the people are not able to afford their resources. It creates this, recession type situation where, you know, it doesn't matter how many dollars you have, if there's not enough resources for everybody to get, then the cost of everything goes up, and then it's always the people with the least that end up suffering the most and first. And then ironically, that's usually who they send to the front lines, you know, to fight, because those are the ones that are desperate enough that can be signed on to go and be a part of the advance of, you know, fighting in order to, you know, control the situation in some regard. And it's just this constant reinforcement of just terrible, terrible situations. You know, nobody can be well in that situation. Nobody. And so my heart goes out to these people. I mean, I read something today, only in brief, so I won't go like in great detail about it because I'm not like, you know, expert about it. But it caught my eye and it touched my heart, and it was from, I believe it was one of the people who deals with like the energy part of the economy of Qatar. I'm sorry that I don't reference to know his specific name, but again, I didn't go in like deep in with it. It was just something that I read to be like, wow, the impacts are just cascading and it's so dire and desperate. You know, but this individual was just like calling out the situation for what it is. It's like, you cannot expect that things are going to get better if you continue to try to use force. We have to use, you know, diplomacy and dialogue, and that's the only way that we're going to send a clear message that things are okay, you know? That's not exactly what he said, but that's a doggerel sum up in a sense of just like, you know, especially calling out, you know, Trump for, it's like, I don't understand what your objective is here, because, you know, you're certainly not making, you know, the world a safer place by going in, you know, haphazardly, you know, going after this nation that, you know, you have claimed to, you know, long target, but then not think about the consequences that this was going to have, you know, cascading detrimental effects because of this very vital, you know, water throughway that, you know, is one of the only lanes of, you know, channel passing for ships to go out of this area. And it accounts for one of the most significant, you know, flows of, you know, supply in the most vital resource in the world right now, which is energy. How could you not think that that was going to be like an outcome consequence for this? You know, how did you think these people were just going to let you come in and bomb them? They're going to be like, thanks, you know, for the care package. No. And then it's like the only way to stop all that craziness, you know, that's happening with the energy supply chains, and everybody's feeling the heat, and, you know, the temperature's going up and the price is going up, and, you know, it's getting more complex and difficult for everybody. Like, the only way to stop that, you know, gaping wound that's, you know, very trauma wound that's happened, is to, you know, stop the fighting and to, you know, commit yourself to cease in fighting, and commit yourself in an intentional way to say that we are going to cease from fighting, cease from doing anything to you for a standard set amount of time, and then keep that commitment, because what you're trying to do is to establish rapport of trust, to regain all the trust that was lost when you manipulated people into thinking that you're there on good faith terms to negotiate, you know, about the nuclear program or whatever, and then, you know, used it as a cover to go and bomb the heck out of everybody. So the, you know, Iranian leadership doesn't have any reason to trust America, so they have, you know, America as a government has to do the right thing by establishing, you know, a olive branch extended in a peace offering to say, you know, we're willing to stop what we're doing right here, right now, exactly in this point in time. And for this point in time, we are not going to, you know, take any action against you at all. We're going to give you time to recover. We're going to give you time to heal, you know. We're going to extend you an apology for the loss of civilian lives, especially for the young girls. My heart just It's always innocence that ends up paying the price for violence. And for America to, say our ultimate objective from here on out is to find a way to establish mutual accords with Iran. And to do so with the intention that we do not want for anybody in that region to be under constant threat or, conflict with one another. We don't want the greater world to have to worry about there being some new conflict spawning from this. And we as America don't want to conflict with you. We would like to establish a mutual accord, to find a way for us to be able to find some sort of consensus of what would serve the best interest of everybody involved, and start making amends for the things that we know that we have done wrong. And POTUS 47 should apologize and say, this was wrong. You can't go back and undo the things that have been done, but you can say, this was wrong. This was a misguided decision. We are sorry for the misunderstanding that led to these outcomes. We are sorry for the loss of life. Yes, even for, the terrible leader that, is now gone. No matter how much we think that person was terrible, that was still, somebody's family. That was still somebody that meant a lot to many of the people in Iran. And yes, there were probably a bunch of people in Iran that were glad that they're gone. And I get that, and I respect that, and I understand that. But the question is, how are any of us, including those people, better off now than when they were before this whole crazy circumstance occurred? And everything that we've lost at this point can never come back. But what we can do is to make a choice to say, we don't want to lose ourselves. We don't want to lose those things that matter. We don't want to, continue to be on the losing end of things, And everybody, all parties involved, even the people that have been dragged into this that are just neighboring countries, nobody wants to continue to lose in this. Lose the things that matter. The sensibility that we don't have to worry about conflict. We don't have to worry about, is there going to be a bomb that's going to go off? We don't have to worry about, are my loved ones safe? We don't have to worry about, are violent forces going to rise up in the chaos and start, wreaking havoc on everybody, which includes, military forces as well as just people who are bad actors who see an opportunity to take advantage of the chaos and the pandemonium. There's so many people, and I care deeply, about everybody, to not want for anybody to suffer any further. And so absolutely the right thing to do is to say, we're done, we're stopping, and I'm sorry. And we know it's a long and it's a hard road back towards, an accord to which we can mutually respect one another, so that, conflict is not the hot button and we're not immediately at each other's throat, but to find a way to separate ourselves in due respects so that we don't, be in each other's way, but also make sure that we're keeping each other safe, And again, I understand that this sounds optimistically naive. I understand the dynamics of the situation. I'm not ignoring them, and I'm not consigning them off like it's not a big deal. But I'm focusing on the things that matter. I'm focusing on what next needs to be done at this point. And I know the answer to that is not to continue to bomb people. I see it as that we need to establish just, fair, reasonable, right orientation with one another, so that we can be in a position by which we can start working together in the same similar direction, at the very least, both in the direction towards ceasing direct conflict and the use of violence and the use of arms, and not to use the term lightly as it is constantly thrown around, a ceasefire. I want the conflict to cease. Put a period at the end of it and say it's done. And then take extreme ownership for what happened by saying, regardless of whatever justifications, that has been given by the, POTUS 47's administrations thus far, accept extreme ownership and responsibility that there is no justification for this happening. That this was the wrong thing to do. And that there's no good outcomes out of it. There isn't. Because nobody is better off now that this has happened. And I understand people will probably want to argue, the leader that is now gone was bad. I get that. I understand. But look what has sprung up in the place of that is somebody who, has even more, conviction of wanting to be aggressive and to do harm to others because they have a sensibility of the loss of their entire family, and now they have every reason to want to be more aggressive, and so you just created something far worse than what was there before. What was there before wasn't great, but there was something that you could have worked with and not, and you know that. Why? How do you know that? Well, because Iran trusted America to sit down at the negotiation table and to work things out. And unfortunately, POTUS 47 and his regime, with the people that he's sent as, envoys to go and send this, offering of, signing a deal to, deal with the nuclear situation with Iran, each time they did that only resulted in America making a military attack on Iran. Completely wrong move, and operating from a place that POTUS thinks that, well, America just has this mighty force and we could just throw everything we got at them and we'll just obliterate them and take them out, problem solved, nothing that we have to worry about anymore. It's like, but why would you want for, such a disastrous situation that you create that will have so many negative outcome consequences from it, because nothing good can come from that. Stopping the problem now is only creating the problem magnified in the future that you're still going to have to deal with. To the point where the first time, the U.S. decided to bomb Iran at the behest of Israel, led to us now going even harder against them. This is only going to be an escalation. And the only way to stop it is to choose to stop. So, with all of that, of course it's been mulling in my head, like I'm frustrated. Very frustrated that this is what's happening, and I really wish it was just as simple as everybody just stop and let's work towards, mutual, trajectory of leading towards an imperishable world peace together. We don't want to conflict anymore. Let's move towards, peaceful accords. It's not possible while the United States of America is being led by a warmonger, somebody who thinks this is a game, or to take it so unseriously that he doesn't even follow what's happening to the point where he could say with certainty, when questioned about any of the events that are unfolding, such as, be answerable to, with some sense of, understanding what happened in regards to the girls' school. Was that America? And if it was, what are you going to do about this? That was wrong. How do you plan to set that right? And instead of having an answer, he's constantly deferring to, this claim of ignorance. You're the commander-in-chief. This happened because of your orders, and you have to take extreme ownership of all of the outcome consequences, and for you to blatantly speak to people directly as if, well, I don't know. Well, how come you don't know? This should be the most important thing in your entire world right now. You should be focused on nothing else. You shouldn't be taking, side trips to go golf and de-stress. You should be constantly in the Situation Room working out feasibility plans to get a full understanding of how deep we're in it and how we're going to dig ourselves back out of it. And POTUS is just not about that. He has no desire for peace. He just wants complete obliteration. Total and utter whatever, conceding to, almighty America and, rule us from a distance or some randomness like that. I don't think it's in the best interest of Iran to, surrender to America, because America doesn't even know what it's doing, America's a, people. We know what we're doing and we're trying to make it stop. We don't want this to happen. None of us want this war. But POTUS, the person who's making the decisions to do this, in a unitary fashion, he does want for this to happen. But we don't know why he wants it to happen, other than he really likes to blow stuff up. He really likes to, talk about the blood and the gore and all the, destruction and the, he thinks this is, just like some kind of movie, and it's just this thing he's so far removed from. He's never had to live an experience of war before. He doesn't know what it's like to be a soldier, and he's being, egged on by this, Department of Defense head who is a mindless radical that is way out of his league and way beyond, his capacity to handle the situation, with the type of, responsibility that's necessary, and so, this is just massively unfortunate. But these people are making decisions that are not even in the best interest of America. So just off of that, that's just the basic, right? POTUS 47 is making bad decision on the behalf of America and is ruining things for Americans here, making the American people suffer from increased prices, this heightened threat level in our nation, worried about retaliation coming after us, and then knowing he's hired nothing but a bunch of incompetent sycophants, so it's not like anybody's watching our back in case people are, pissed off and going to come after us. Cost of everything's about to go up, so much more than it was before. Businesses are going to start to shut down because they're going to be, too strapped for cash, and they're not going to be able to hold out until, the end of whenever Trump decides, on his whim that this is over. He's ruining things for America. So why in the world would any nation say, yes, I surrender to the nation that's self-destructing because of this terrible precedent? Please, you control our nation from a distance and dictate to us, what we can have happen here. Nobody's going to willingly surrender to such a weak and feeble and incompetent person who is ruining things for his own country. You know what I'm saying? So, it's just this big, huge, nonsensical mess, and we're all trying to make sense of it as Americans, and I get it. It's frustrating because, from one second to the next, we don't understand the reasoning, because there is no reason. We don't understand, the methods, because their method is just madness, and we don't understand, how we can entrust that tomorrow is going to be better when every single day things just progressively get worse and matters are made worse by the terrible decision making that the POTUS 47 regime is making in the aftermath of their own past and prior shitty decision making. and then the whole world is suffering. I'm thinking of all of these, neighboring nations that, may not have been in peace, but they certainly weren't in this heightened intensity of conflict before all of this happened, and it's destabilizing them. And just when they were probably working towards trying to create stability, even in the midst of conflict, there's ways to create islands of coherence. And that's something that you can, set yourself up for success as you slowly start to grow out from that more and more coherence that can help to, break away chains of violence that happen and outcome consequences of instabilities, and eventually get to the point where things could be stabilized and conflict lessens over time. And these nations were trying to work towards that, and we're trying to establish a global order in which we can all work together in such a way where nobody wants to have a global war, nobody wants to have that instability. We all want to just do awesome and be awesome together, and any of the people who want to fight because it's they're warmongering, hateful people that want to hurt others, because it makes them feel good about themselves, those people become less and less powerful when we start reinforcing more and more towards a sensibility that, we're building out a world that works for everybody, and you're either with us or we're going to leave you behind because we're not going to give you anything anymore that you're going to be able to feed off of. Start establishing that coherence, start working towards aligning ourselves with something that is far more tangible than just signing some peace treaty with each other that can eventually break down the road. It's working together in step, in consort, complementary ways, that my success is your success, and, moving in the same direction together intentionally. That's how we establish peace. But you can't do that if you're blowing people up because, it goes back to, I made a video not too long ago about this, discussing it shortly after it happened. Israel is wrong, and they're making poor decisions, and it's not Israel as a nation, it's Netanyahu who is ruining his entire nation, and all of these good people are being turned in a bad direction. They're being led astray, and they're being led to believe that this violent approach to their existence somehow is justified, when it's not, because it's not based in integrity. And things that are not based in integrity will eventually fall apart. There's no deservedness in the methods that you're using, and I understand there's conflict in the region, and there's a sense of needing to assert yourself and protect yourself against people who, don't want you to succeed. I get that. But you don't achieve success with, the respects of honor and deservedness if your methods to which you use, is a default to violence against other people. Violence breeds violence. And so you may have been able to advance your, nation in this way or that way, but at every advance, you are jeopardizing everything that you have, because you're moving in the wrong direction. You're trying to get it through force, and this force and this violence will have bad karma that's going to come back on you, and then you're just reinforcing this cyclic cycle of violence and negative outcome consequences. And my heart hurts for people in Israel, knowing that, they're being forced to fight in a war, or, compelled or convinced to do this, but there's nothing righteous about it. And now Netanyahu has dragged America into it because he happened to have the ear of POTUS 47. And, POTUS 47 did not do his due diligence. He did not do right by the American people because he did not think about us first. He put himself and his relationship with Netanyahu before anything else, and decided to act preemptively, for a potentiality that maybe, some of our assets would be harmed in the region or something like that, because Netanyahu was going to, whether you're with me or not, I'm going to go and do this, and I'm going to put you in harm's way, so, you might as well be in with me. That's increasingly looking like what ended up actually happening. And it's tragic and it's unfortunate because, America would have had a better standing to say no. And you have to be as enthusiastic with your no as you are with your yes. And you have to mean it to say no. Now, and if you choose to do this, because I can see, talking to my advisors that would actually give me good advice, say that this is going to put America's interests at harm in this area. And I'm going to tell you this, that if you act in this way, in such a short timeline, and that it's going to put us in a precarious situation, and you're not going to give us the opportunity to reinforce this situation, pull back, our forces from the area, get our civilians out, do the things that make sure it protects American interests. You are working against America's best interest, and guess what? There's going to be consequences to that, and such that our alliance and how we relate with one another probably don't need to be working out in this way anymore, and we're going to have to put some separation between us and our relationship, because you're compromising it, and we refuse to compromise our values in order to suit your sensibilities, and you're not even being sensible or reasonable about it, For years, Netanyahu has been claiming that Iran is right there. They're ready to have a nuclear bomb, And there was nothing based off of intelligence that existed to suggest that that was actually the case. He has been hardlining and pressing to make an attack on Iran, because he needed them to be obliterated for whatever advancement he personally is seeking. So he set everybody up for failure. And people misplaced trust in him, and now we're all living in the outcome consequences of his terrible decision making. He compromised us, he sacrificed us, and now he is living out his best dream because this is what he wanted all along. And America's in this precarious situation where now we're going to have to, separate ourselves from Israel even more than what we would have if we would have said no to begin with. And said, no, man, you're a bad influence on us, and we are not going to be a part of this shenanigans. Now that we're in it, it's like, you never should have put us in this situation. How dare you? Look at how you have destabilized everybody in the region. For what? For what? Now you've pissed Iran off even more than what they were pissed off at everybody before. Like, that does not make the world safer. And now we're in this situation where, POTUS 47 is not willing to admit he's wrong, or did the wrong thing, or made a bad decision, He's not willing to take extreme ownership for it. So he's more willing to just throw everything at it until he can say we've achieved success in order to save face. When what he should be doing is putting a stop to this stupid war. Turn to Netanyahu and say, how dare you put America in this situation? Turn to Iran and say, we did you wrong. We did you wrong. This never should have happened. But we're coming into this situation with the intent to set things right. Give some space for everybody to think on it for a little while. Reinforce ourselves to make sure that we don't have to worry about retaliation coming from people who have no reason to trust us now. Focusing on keeping our home safe, getting our house in order. And then turning to them constantly, offering that olive branch to say, our intention is to set this right. Our intention is to get to a path to peaceful accord. Our intention is to make right by you in the ways that we did you wrong. Take ownership for it. Use this as an opportunity. There's always opportunity in chaos. Use this as an opportunity to advance forward a peace process that can achieve the objectives that everybody in that region has wanted for so long. How can we find a way to live amongst each other without constantly having to worry about new conflicts spurring up? Or old heated rivalries, spawning into some overflow that ends up harming civilians or destabilizing the region in some new form or fashion. And with that, it comes to, if I was POTUS, that's what I would do. And I understand that that is the long haul process. It's the long game that would be playing. It's not expecting this is going to be resolved in a day or in 2 weeks or on our short timeline. It's understanding this is going to take time, and it's going to take a full commitment. It's going to take a commitment that's probably going to surpass any one-term presidency. But with every passing day, working in the direction towards a resolution of a path towards peace, moving on a continuum of an imperishable world peace, that's what we're working towards. And working towards it every day and showing up every day and saying, I'm showing up in here to do the good work. What can we accomplish together today to make things right for all parties involved? And go forward with that type of objective, that type of orientation, that sensibility about it. And understand people at first might not take it seriously because world peace, who in their right mind would think that's possible, It's going to be the hard thing to convince people of, but it's the right thing to do. And to hold by that with conviction, to say we're going to work towards that, and work towards it in such a way that there isn't going to be some new president that's going to be able to come in the future that has some wild hair up their ass to want to go bomb everybody because, playing, like children playing with G.I. Joe soldiers, like it doesn't matter, like there's not consequences. But to set up such an opportunity for us to work together and such a, integrity in which what we build is building out substance that becomes like this, fundamental framework of stability that everybody benefits from. And so it becomes less and less, in our personal and collective interests to mess things up, and work towards that every day. It reminds me of, a concept that I've spoken on before called the Iron Maiden. It's a way of just creating a system by which conflicting sides can enter in a space of where there's, pressures and there's limits that are placed upon them. And it kind of holds them in a holding pattern until they work out their differences. There's a thing that's between them that prevents them from coming after each other again. But there's also things that are containing them within that space that prevent them from retreating and not working on solving for this difficult problem of finding peaceful resolution, that is a constancy. And slowly over time, you move out of that. The walls start to fall away, the space in between you, instead of it being this negative thing that's keeping you apart, it starts to become the leverage by which you can build something together. And then that peaceful accord that's established over time is the healing balm that helps us to forgive the past of, the violence and the, aftermath, unfortunate aftermath of, conflict that has happened. And, I really believe that's something that we can utilize and make work in this situation in terms of Israel, the US, and Iran. I think this is something that can happen in terms of Israel and Gaza. I think this can happen in terms of Russia and Ukraine. I think this can happen in terms of most of our global conflicts against, differing, interests from, different, forces, different nations, different peoples. And it's a way by which we can start establishing, again, something that conflicting sides can work on and build towards together, but it's also something that we as a collective, global, we're all in this together, kind of relationship with one another, to start adding things to the, establishment of coherence, to which, now the conflicting parties are not just thinking we're building something together that helps to stabilize our relationship, but everybody else wants for our success so much that they're building out stabilities that can connect with that too. So once we get our differences sorted out and we have come to the mutual accord that what we're building on is much more bigger than, any conflict, and it is more important than any conflict that we have, and we can let those things go, intentionally work through the process of forgiving what had happened in the past, then other nations can start bringing in their work to say, well, we can trust to take the things that we've been building on separately, to connect in with the things that you've been building upon. And then it's a reinforcement across the board where everybody is able to come together in a way where you might not be able to have such direct contact with certain people because there's just so much history there and so many conflicting interests. But there's a way for us to come at each other in a way that we are establishing a mutual accord, building out the future together that says, we all want for stability and peace and order. We want to know that our children have a future. We want to know that, we can start prospering together. We want everybody to have their life and to live it well. We want everybody to live in peace and to not fear for, conflict. We want people to be able to pursue their happy lives, and for their happiness not to be derived off a sick, twisted perversion of liking to harm people, and that's fun. It's not. A healthy happiness, that's conducive to well-being. And, for people have the liberty to live their lives and be in contribution to the betterment of the world together. That's what welfaring stewardship is all about. And I see, even in these dark times of conflict, the opportunity for us to really set ourselves up for success in the way of saying, we do have a choice here. We can choose to continue to go down this continuum of, negative outcome consequences, and it's all spectacle, and it's terrible. Or we can choose for ourselves a different way and move with intention, as ever, slow and methodical and intentional and purposeful, and patient, and conscious. This has to be a conscious act. We have to really, really try for this. We have to really want for it, and be willing to do the hard and necessary work of healing, coming to terms in a sense of forgiveness, because it's important for us to be okay. It's not saying what happened is okay. It says that we're okay. And from here, we're going to move forward in a direction that's good. And for us to help to create a situational context and a fine context where people can start living out in that. So day by day, we're establishing a historical context that says, yes, we know what peace is. We know how to live it out in our best way. And we're doing for that in an intentional way, And so as far as America is concerned, again, if I was POTUS, I would be, advancing forth proposals that would help us to get at this problem in such a way that helps to resolve it, in the shortest time possible, without the disadvantage of anybody, and to help to make it so that everybody has the potential for peace. And that's what we stay committed to. I think America really needs to take on a new orientation with how we establish ourselves as a nation. I think that it is an inherent vulnerability to have the capacity or the potential for a rogue POTUS to go off and force Americans into this precarious situation of a, war for nothing. And so that means that we really have to start reimagining this thing we call governance in our nation. The American people should have say in what's happening, and to the point where we have a capacity to stop it before it gets out of hand, and to rein in the powers of a rogue president and put them in check. Congress is supposed to have this capacity, but they're failing to do their duty, and they're failing to serve on behalf of the American people. And so in that sort of case, if the first line of defense is supposed to be that Congress is the ones who declares war, POTUS can take military action, but only if it's reasonable. To go to war, you have to get Congress approval. And if Congress isn't willing to put the check on the power of the president to say, it's one thing to do, a military, action. It's a different thing to do a military excursion, and it's a very, very different thing to do a prolonged, intentional bombardment of another nation, for any justification, because that is warring. And that ultimately rests with Congress to determine. But if Congress isn't going to assert that authority and stop the president from going rogue and ruining things for everybody, then the American people should have the capacity to step in and say, no, enough is enough. We're taking back our power. We are limiting your power and capacity to do this. Because who's the one who has to go to war? It's the American people. Who are the ones who are having to pay the price for everything, the cost of everything going up? The American people. Who are the ones that are now having to worry about whether or not there's going to be a draft and everybody's just going to have to be thrown into, fighting something that we don't even know what it stands for? The American people, And if it's anything, like Trump, should have gone to war. But he was a draft dodger. So you can't expect him or people in his family, or people like him, in these upper echelons of society to be the ones that are going to be going to the front lines. To consign Americans as cannon fodder in a fight for nothingness, no president should have the capacity to be able to do that. There should be a capacity for a corrective mechanism. If Congress won't hold his hand, to stay his hand, the American people need to stay the hand of Congress, force them to stay his hand. Checks and balances. This is why we need a civics branch of government. We need the American people to have leverage in our government to make Congress do their job, and to be able to have a connection with POTUS to give him a voice of reason. Imagine if there was a voice of reason for Trump right now. To say, what are you thinking? Like, I don't know where this came from, out of, just nowhere, and out of nothing. You've just, made this whole justification to drag America into this crazy, infighting with another nation. Like, what are we getting out of it again? Oh, you mean nothing? This sensibility that, you cut off the head of, the Hydra, but more are growing back, even more pissed off than ever. Like, this isn't comforting. And now made this, channel by which most of our, throughways for, the transport of supply chains has to go through this channel. And now it has been compromised, and potentially landmines or, water mines being laid to the point where, it makes it unsafe for ships to go through there. Like, this is a messed up situation. What were you thinking, And to reasonably, not just the rich and the powerful people, which are the only voices that he actually, tunes into, but everyday Americans to say, my son or daughter is serving, and now they've been deployed there, and I'm quite concerned for their life because, they're in this dangerous situation. Are you doing anything to help to settle things down so that they can, come home soon? Or I have a son and daughter that may be deployed, and we just want to know, we're waiting in this holding pattern of, are we going to get the orders that we have to go? How long is this going to be? And the people who are serving, who are every day, asking themselves and each other, can you believe this? Can you believe where we are and what we're doing? How are they reconciling this and making sense of it? it would be nice if they had a capacity to speak to the president too. For president to hear them out and say, listen, I understand you made a decision, but your decision has consequences, and this is the consequences of lived experience that I'm having to endure now. You know, and it's a state of anxiety. When you're in a military hot zone, you are in combat zone. I mean, the anxiety and the uncertainty and the adrenaline and the frustration and the fear, and then, you know, knowing people are getting hurt and knowing people have already died, like, this messes with your mind. Even if, you know, and I pray for the protection of all of our military service members who are involved in this, you know, like, even if you're not in direct path of harm's way, there's nothing to say that you're safe from something happening unexpectedly, you know. And so this terrible situation that we've been thrown into, like, it would be helpful if people who are suffering outcome consequences from this, you know, all the people that are paying more money at the pump, the fact that, you know, grocery prices are already being shot up, you know, people are having to make different plans for, you know, travel, and making different plans for, you know, having to save money to be able to send to their family members who live in these, you know, conflicting areas that, you know, the cost of everything's going up, and so they're going to need more support. They you know, need supplies being brought to them. They are put in this terrible, you know, precarious situation. And for Americans to be able to voice that to POTUS, and for POTUS to have to hear it, you know, I think it would help to shape his decision making, because he would be more conscious of the outcome consequences of his decisions, you know. Even if he's not naturally a person that has a conscience and is just like, oh, right, wrong, you know, being, you know, unavoidably communicated to by the American people that says, stop, please, what are you doing? You know, this is hurting me in these ways. And for POTUS to not be able to ignore that tragedy that everybody's facing, have to come to terms with that, as this is also part of your decision-making process. You have to consider these things, you know, not just your self-centeredness. I think we would have different outcomes. And so I think it's important that in our technologically advanced age that we have a means to establish a direct line of communication with POTUS that says, this is the will of the people. Govern on our behalf, you know. And then in a sense of, you know, America needs to be a strong nation, and that strength needs to come from integrities. You know, we abide by laws, you know, we understand our Declaration of Independence says this is what we won't stand for. You know, our Constitution says this is what we do stand for. We adhere to that. We pursue our preamble promise. You know, and so if we're making decisions based off of we're trying to achieve our preamble promise, domestic tranquility just being one of them alone, like, you can't have domestic tranquility if you're going out and picking wars with random countries, you know. And you certainly aren't providing for the common defense if you're doing that, and then allowing those people who are supposed to be protecting, you know, our home, you know, Department of Homeland Security and the FBI are, you know, shell of a, you know, program, and they're not able to do their full job. And so you're putting us in a precarious situation. That's not anything for anybody to stake confidence in. You know, companies, how can a company, you know, make any economic decisions in this nightmare of a mess of uncertainty, where you don't know from one second to the next why we're doing this, or, you know, how long it's going to last, or, you know, what it's for. Or are we going to make matters worse? You know, in different parts of the world, they're going to screw over supply chains that we're not going to be able to provide, you know, our business. So many negative outcomes. that everybody at every level of society is having to deal with now. You know, that's not a stable, secure situation that everybody can thrive on. So, you know, America's strength comes from our capacity to create a secure situation that everybody can thrive on. And our government is supposed to be about provisioning, accommodating, stewarding, and supporting and stabilizing and securing that type of situation for all of us. And we need to focus on the importance of the individual in society, you know, personal dominion and our self-sovereignty, the fact that we should be able to have the capacity to, you know, assert ourselves and say, no, we don't want for this. Also to be able to assert ourselves to say that, you know, our interests need to be considered as well, because we're interdependently, you know, involved in this, which comes into the strength of our union. You know, society has to be, in order for it to be free, has to be this spontaneous, voluntary cooperation with one another. We have to be in popular participation and to constantly work together to reinforce the strength of our personal dominions, you know, and the strength of our collective state and the strength of our union as we're forming together. And we have to have this more direct democracy in the form of a civics branch of government, because then the nation becomes more like a cooperative. You know, we're all in it. We all have stake in the game, seat at the table, skin in the game, these sorts of things. And that should be an orientation that involves citizens in their own right, and then also non-citizens who are here as, you know, immigrants or people that are trying to integrate into society, or even just people who come here to visit and travel. They have to feel like when they come here, you know, they're not an outcast or an outsider, you know, but they are, you know, a part of the American experience while they're here too, and that is a position of due respects, and from that we do consider you as well. And we have to kind of look at, you know, like a civics branch of a government is kind of like having everyone being delegates in this, you know, a civic congress together. We need to have the opportunity to sit at the table and to debate, you know, our concerns about things. We have to be able to work together towards futures planning. We have to, you know, establish goals together and objectives. We have to create initiatives and work together to achieve them, you know, and to each of us take on projects that can, you know, take an approach of an open bidding, like, you know, who in the prospective contractors are willing to involve themselves in this to get these things done, you know, and then every person can offer, you know, in their bidding to take on the tasks to get these things done, what their approach is going to be, you know, how they intend to achieve it. And then everybody works together towards establishing how do we vote to decide what projects we're going to advance and who we're going to allow to do those things, you know, and what is going to be the fair compensation for them in that regard. And we do this because we want to make sure that we're working towards developing things that are suited for mutual interests of achieving welfaring stewardship. We have to create that welcoming, thriving situation for everybody, and we're only going to be able to do that if we see the needs in society and address those needs in society and work towards accomplishing those in an innovative approach. And then always seek best practices from everybody, and then find the best ways to do it, and then make the advancements, you know, and investments to make those advancements. What Eudaimonian politics really is about is like taking this consideration of our nation as being something that is like a techno-innovative approach in a etho-environmental, you know, construct of an econ-political orientation of interdependent governance. We have to work together in mutualisms to achieve welfaring stewardship because we agree it's in our collective best interests. And again, looking at America kind of like a co-op, we are all citizens and we're working together to also get the buy-in of, you know, immigrants who are here as well to work towards helping to make a secure situation in America. In order to do this, everybody has to feel like we have, you know, our own independence, and that requires strong dominion. So the government can't come in and tell you what to do, think, or feel, you know, control or run your life. You know, and this is the way in which we secure the sense that everybody has protection of their property, including their personal self. That you are self-possessed, that you're not possessed by your government that can just, use you like a warm body to throw as cannon fodder to some war. Like, if you're going to get somebody to go and fight a war for you, it has to be, compel them to, be, to join forces and to fulfill their oaths, in pledge of service, and respect that mutual relationship of, it's not a one-way street, respect and honor the service that they give. And in order to achieve this like reinforcement of independence for people, we have to allow for them to accumulate personal property, establish self-sovereignty, personal dominion. I am my own possession, and that property needs to be protected even from the government infringing and telling you how to run your life. But then that also includes the need for the establishment of holistic wealth that people can build up generationally, and that starts with having something that everybody can benefit from, which is like a universal basic innovation that everybody gets in like a resource commons kind of way to start establishing and building up wealth for themselves over time. This is a way to help people level up their lives, and it's a resource commons that can be funded by a stewardship tax. And this helps also keep a check that everybody can access it, but those over a certain higher income really wouldn't want to, because it's more like taking a hit with, their, personal lives if they pool from this, resource. And, but they do have to still contribute. And this can be, controlled in such a way where it's reasonable. It's like we're all in this together. We all have to contribute something. But we're not forcing, people to, take from this if they don't need it. And then the people that really don't need it, it can fund things for themselves, probably shouldn't be drawing from it. But they absolutely have to contribute because we're all in this together. It's a reasonable way to be able to create the, fair share sensibilities of things. And it doesn't have to be a tremendous amount. That stewardship tax can really be about, how do we create efficiencies in the systems to reduce the cost as much as possible, to still get the optimization for achieving the things that we would want to have done. It would become, again, for, the richer people wouldn't want to, draw from it because it would be more like a penalty than a benefit. But when you have a universal basic innovation, that everybody can draw from, to be able to mutually benefit, it's like a standard in society that everybody can level up from. It takes away, the welfare structures, and it turns it into welfaring scaffoldings for our lives. And it's something by which nobody will fall under that certain, baseline standard of society. But it's also something through your own personal ownership of, taking advantage of this great opportunity of a fair shake that is accessible to everybody. You get to negotiate your labor contributions with employers in terms of like what your service value is going to be. And in those agreements, in keeping with, keeping the control of, your own value that you're creating in your own hands, and you have an opportunity to negotiate with, employers like what your actual worth is going to be. And of course, establishing a baseline minimum wage that says like it can't fall below this, because then it sets the standard of an unfair system where, people could try to undercut, and that ends up undermining the entire value structure that we create. So, minimum wage is about setting that standard to make sure that nobody goes below that, so we keep, our level of what we deem as fair compensation, as set, that it can't be below this, because, we're establishing that as fairness. And anything below that is an undercut, and it undermines the entire system. And then, everybody working together to maintain this standard level of our established, collective best interest of establishing wealth and prosperity for ourselves and for others, to reinforce our resource commons that, comes in the form of these universal basic innovations that we can benefit from, take advantage of to help level up our lives. And it keeps us in this constant state of what I like to call the criterion echelon of society. Everybody lives at that criterion standard of a good life. And there are more than enough opportunities for you, upon a fair shake, take advantage of the opportunities available to you to level up, and become a prospect in society in terms of if you can do this with just these basic things that everybody else gets to benefit from, you can take that in your own unique, talented ways to make more and more out of it, and while you advance, you're not leaving anybody behind. Everybody has the same opportunity to come with you. But you can make advancements, and your achievements, we want you to strive for your highest ideals, but then also recognizing there is a point in time when we have to have a limit, because then it becomes a deviation where wealth accumulation and wealth hoarding becomes so excessive that it creates an imbalance, and equilibrium in society falls apart, because resources are not allocated and distributed in such a way that can be consistent with a free market society. We have to keep resources free and abundant and moving and accessible to everybody, and not saying that everybody gets to have a yacht or something like that, but not everybody wants one, and yes, you strive and work towards those things, and that should be your goal and your reward for your achievements and intentional success. But your possession of a yacht should not mean that there are people that have to live on the streets because you are so busy paying for your yacht with your accumulated hoard of resources that you can't pay your workers to the point where they can, afford to live and be an employee, to the point where they have to live on the streets or sleep in their cars, in order to just afford to go to work for you. This is an unfair system, so there has to be bounds to it that keep things in check. And that is achieved by creating an equilibrium tax that says we're going to rein you in if you get too high, but we're compensating with what we do rein you in with, invest in reinforcing the standard to bring it up so you don't have to go too low, but we're going to create the equilibrium to make sure that things don't get too far, out of hand. And then create the stages of economic uplift opportunity through a scaffolding of our lives so that nobody gets left behind, but there are consistent opportunities for people to make great advances, especially in terms of we need this done, we need that done, man, we need some talented skill to do this sort of work, and those are the opportunities of a fair shake that people can show up and show out for and do good things for us and help us to advance, so it should be a calling to people to say, we need innovators, come up with an innovation that can help us advance in these sorts of ways, and just leave that as a recurring calling. And then when something big happens, we need to adjust for this now, and everybody can come, and everybody has the feasibility to be able to do that sort of work. That it's not a matter of, whether you have access to certain types of materials or access to certain type of equipment. Those sorts of things should be provided, in a collective resource commons way, which, especially in terms of manufacturing and developing new innovations, we should have a Maker's Mall as our new type of education system, replacing, traditional schools with these experiential learning centers that are kind of like a mall where people can go and make stuff, use the tooling and the resources that are there and make things and learn how to make things, and they can be, innovators without, you don't have to have the laboratory or the workspace that's available already for everybody. And then, welfare and stewardship is also about making sure when we're prioritizing welfare and stewardship with our economy, we are setting that up as, the free and fair exchange among all collective participants. And it's our perspective economics, and it helps us to contract with one another and to establish a general workforce of labor that can, labor of contract entrepreneurs. And so we're really establishing the labor market as it is now. We may not be able to get companies that have the capacity to hire people, so jobs aren't necessarily being created, but there's a lot of work that still needs to be done, and it can be accomplished if people are empowered as entrepreneurs. They could fulfill those roles in society, and then having what I like to call a great care package available to, labor force workers and labor force entrepreneurs, to access, the resources that they need in order to support themselves in a stabilizing way to uphold the standard of a good life, where they might not be able to afford to pay for all of these things themselves. But if they had those things provided for them, they would be able to afford to go do this good work that's necessary in order for us to establish our welfare and stewardship development. So this is things like, you may need daycare for your child. Well, that can be provisioned through the Might of Great Care package. You can access that. You get the, care that you need for your children. And then you can go focus on doing the good work that's in service to society that nobody else can do like you can do. And so we need you to be able to, be liberated from having to, be there and care for your children, have somewhere good, healthy, safe space for them to go to, and receive child development from, brilliant, teachers, and you can go focus on taking risks for higher things, contributing to society. We need to help each other out in all of these different ways. And we have the capacity to be able to do that for just uplifting everybody into a standard of living, offering them access to, this resource commons of, pooling of tooling and resources that they, might need, and then the Might of Great Care so they can tap into the type of, supports that they need in order for them to be able to afford to do the good work that they can do, but maybe, can't do because they can't get paid enough to be able to pay for their way to be able to afford to work. That's a big limit in society as to why we don't have more productivity. So, and especially if it's in a sense of the resource commons is paid for, by a stewardship tax that everybody contributes to. And then we have a portions tax that helps to fund for the payment of people who take on these projects. And then the people themselves get to elect what projects get done, and they get to select, what bid, gets accomplished. So there isn't favoritism in the game. It really is who can do the best job, and then, paying a portions tax where people have to pay the tax, but they get to choose what that portion of your tax, what it gets to go to, what projects are we going to advance. You say this is important, okay, that's where you direct your funds to go. And that helps us to push advancements in those directions. And then all of a sudden we're working together, and then coalition building becomes necessary, vital, important. And then that's reinforced by a sense of community and communicating with one another, because you go out and talk to people. It's like, man, I really want you to invest your portions tax into accomplishing this very important project because it's really going to be good in these ways. It's going to have cascading benefits all around. It's going to benefit you and your children, your school and your community, whatever. And then you start communicating with people in society about constructive things that we can do together instead of always infighting about otherisms or weird culture war things that are basically irrelevant. And the only reason why we focus on them is because we don't have something to collectively work towards together. So we can fund these projects through a portion tax that everybody has to pay, and we can fund our welfare and, stewardship projects through those portion taxes, and we can also pay for our Might of Great Care package through our stewardship tax. And then we can have an equilibrium tax, which is just a matter of saying like that baseline standard of society, the things that help us to invest in our universal basic innovations that up-level everybody, that comes from our equilibrium tax. And that brings everybody into this system of just like opportunities abounding everywhere. And it's like, choose your adventure game. How do you want to show up, But then a consistent directive of like how we're going to accomplish that. And that's where it comes into a sense of the need to have a promotion of a decentralized, non-hierarchical economic relationship and growth within a moderating framework that liberates without waste, fraud, and greed, abuse, or harm. And this is talking about establishing an auxiliary economics that leads us in the direction towards a proper capitalism, so that the state of our wealth distribution is done via stewardship, portions, and equilibrium tax, into an economics that is a non-monopolized, market-driven competitive capital economics based on profit motives with a deviation limit that allows for minimal government intervention in the economy that is moderated to achieve the ends of stewardship. That's where the proper comes in. The proper intended use is to achieve the stewardship outcomes. And this is important to achieve because we are working towards the initiation of our purpose. How are we going to get at something together that could be the thing that reinforces the strength of our union, reinforces the strength of our personal dominion, reinforces the strength of our state, and works together? It sets us up for success. I want America to be a success, but it's not going to happen if we have this very distorted capacity for concentration of power into, a unitary power that, ends up taking us in terrible directions of war and whatnot. America really should be taking on the eudaimonian political approach to a loosely bound power structure system that is engaged based off of values and mission objectives, and we're orienting ourselves towards permission structures that help to control interests, set precedents within a framework that's fluid and internal, and it's an internal formation that distinguishes governance, growth, and enforcement through certain types of actions that we're working on together. These actions hew the synthesis of our power structures that helps us get the work done that benefits the stewardship objectives. The whole purpose of this, the whole, proper intended use of the economics and the proper intended use of our more direct democratic republic is to create an ever more healthy, sustainable, just, and peaceful American situation that can change the external global paradigm to help to match with our internal, state that is conducive to our continued peace, prosperity, and happiness. And we should want for a better world for others, because then that creates a more stable situation for us. We don't have to worry about, other people doing bad things and, wanting to tear us down or bring us down or something like that, because, we're working to help to up-level them as well, and it's in our mutual best interest. And mutualisms is kind of like, it's a simple concept. It's saying, you respect everybody's personal dominion. We work together to take direct action to get things done, certain specific things to get done, and then we respect that, we can't do this out of, pity or, or favoritism. It literally has to be about, we are all in this together, mutual respect, mutual interests, mutual benefits, mutual securities. And to reinforce a sense that there's nothing that's more important or should be more important to us than creating a welcoming situation everybody can thrive on. In an American paradigm, American orientation, American sensibility, that America stands for a nation that works for everyone without the disadvantage of anyone, so nobody gets left behind or kept behind and everybody lives the good life. And we're stewarding outcomes that help us to, live out in, progress, and for our posterity to live out in that same similar progress, the benefits of doing good work on the behalf of everybody's benefit, and reining in this sense of, there will eventually be a day, if we can follow along this continuum long enough and consistently enough and comprehensively and coherently enough, there will become a time along this line of trajectory where the need for governance becomes less and less. So we will effectively be shrinking government down because we need it less, because we just naturally attune with doing the right thing, and we don't need to have as much of a, moderating influence to intervene on our behalf, because we tend to just do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And, when things go awry, we naturally correct those mechanisms and bring things back in accordance. And so we don't necessarily need to have the constructs of government to do that for us. And over time, as we, start to align with this, people will begin to see there's opportunities to do amazing things, build out amazing innovations, advance our future along this trajectory, that's establishing, a continuum of an imperishable world peace, and where everybody's living the good life, everybody's contained in this safe space. And as you start to build out along those lines and start developing, you're no longer building something that's at the sacrifice and disadvantage of anybody. More people will want to help for your success. It's kind of like, if you want this fantastic future, you're going to have to get everybody on board to be able to do it. It would be much easier to get them on board to want to help you to advance this, if they knew that they were coming along too, that it wasn't just going to be a few people that were going to succeed. It's like, we're all going to succeed together. Some of us now are going to succeed, in such a way. But as we start to grow and develop, more potentials for success are going to advance and open for everyone. So then that means that, the future that we're creating for our children is more expansive and full of opportunities and good outcomes that they will be living in. And the useless, the antiquated, the echoing of time of these negative consequences and the pains we've had and suffering diminishes, and it's replaced by this new paradigm that makes that old paradigm obsolete. And we're living in this stable, thriving, positive situation. It doesn't mean that we don't have struggle, and it doesn't mean we don't have challenge, and it doesn't mean that we don't have conflict, in the sense of conflicting interests. But we've matured enough to the point where we realize there's a better way to sort out our differences than it is to, go at it with each other in these violent ways, but rather let's resolve this, ladies and gentlemen, and use our words in dialogue. And and when people are trying to lead us astray, for their own personal gains and advantage, society negatively socially sanctions that, to say, no, we got to reel that in. Come on, you're getting out of line here. Your selfishness is sacrificing this, sanity and well-being of everybody else. And we can't stand for those sorts of things, because it's never going to be a good outcome for you. There's eventually going to be a time where that falls apart, because things not of integrity will fall apart. And the only thing that is of integrity is something that is intent on, committed to, working towards, building out opportunities for all of us to go together, And with that, I just wanted to really emphasize the sensibility. I don't want people to look at the state of things and think this is we're stuck. There's potential to get out of this mess. I don't want people to look at it the only way to solve for this is everybody just opens their bleeding hearts and then all of a sudden changes their minds and just hugs everybody, and then we're all, holding hands in kumbaya. I don't think that that's a possibility, in the realm of possibility right now. Eventually in time, maybe we can, But as of right now, I understand there's a lot of work that has to be done to set things right, and it's not going to be, an easy task. It's going to take intentional, consistent, persistent work. And, as conflicts continue to arise, we always have to default to the sense that we want what is right for everybody. We want to establish justice. We want to ensure domestic tranquility. We want to provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure our blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. So if we want for those things, the whole point of our exercise is to achieve the preamble promise. We can do that in this, orientation of mutualisms, working towards welfare and stewardship on a continuum, and we involve ourselves in getting that done through economic means that helps us shift out of these negative paradigms where, we just had a February jobs report that said we lost 92,000 jobs, unemployment rates ticking up, America's become a stagnation, and then instead of, spending billions of dollars to invest in rejuvenating and stimulating the economy so we can get back to work, we're throwing money away, billions by the day, to go blow up some foreign nation because the current sitting POTUS doesn't know how to deal with domestic orders and administrate, a prosperous situation everybody can thrive on. He only knows how to direct his capacity, power to, press a button and blow something up, Yeah, he might have the power to do that, but, use of power that's unchecked will only come back to, cause harm and damage to everybody else and the consequences. And I say that, we should really send a strong signal to POTUS and everybody in the POTUS 47 administration and everybody who's aligning with helping POTUS 47 to continue to do these negative things that everybody else is suffering from, by rejecting them, rejecting their reality that they're fabricating, reject their lies, reject their plans and their proposals, reject the trajectory they're trying to set us up on, because it's setting us up for failure. Reject everything that they are offering, because nothing that they offer is anything that we want. And send a clear, distinct message that we are not going to be voting for MAGA Republicans coming the next election. We are going to vote intentionally for Democrats who we are going to hold accountable to hold them accountable for their actions of ruining our nation and forcing us into this desperate situation that nobody wants and didn't need to happen, because of their lack of capacity to administrate and to be respectful and honor their oaths of office and to, do right by the American people. Like, their failure to do all of that has to be our reasoning for no longer placing trust in them, and to reject their false reality, and to reject them as politicians outright, and to no longer allow them to be in positions of decision making on our behalf, because they do not care about you, and they do not care about our collective best interests. If they did, right now, you wouldn't be living in a state of fear and terror because America's all of a sudden in this crazy war. That would not be happening if they cared about you, period. And so reject the reality, vote Democrats, hold them accountable to make sure that these people are held accountable, get them, out of office, and, set them on their way, send them on their way. And then start working together towards taking on the responsibility of, if we work towards creating a welfare and stewardship paradigm for America, it's something that we can work on together that can eventually, MAGA people can redeem themselves, in the Republican Party, come back into the light and start working as, a collective best interest of our nation. Abandon this old, useless and antiquated notion that somehow we were going to make America great by failing to do good constantly, and then intentionally inflicting harm on everybody. Like, no, there's nothing great about violence, and there's nothing great about economic, downturns, brought on by shitty decision making with, like, affecting tariffs towards everybody. Nobody's reaping any benefits on that. And then the question that came to mind today, as I was listening to people saying that somebody within the administration or somebody that's aligned with the administration, tried saying like, oh yeah, the government is helping to bring ships across, this channel that's, in this precarious position because Iran could very easily, like, take out any ship that went through there, and U.S. government has, helped them and, cross or whatever. And then the markets kind of, like, slowly, like, made a response in that, and the cost of oil dipped. But it was, like, a false reality that somebody, like, tweeted something false. And then all of a sudden, everybody realized it was a lie and it wasn't real. And then the price went back up. But there was so much loss that was in that situation. I'm thinking to myself, like, who advantaged in that intentional act of deception? Because it's been this whole trend in the administration to do, like, insider trading and to do the betting markets or whatever. Somebody made a lot of money that they, guessed that, Iran would be bombed before Christmas time. Yeah. And these sorts of things is just like, these people are profiting off of their exploitation of power. And, they're playing games with our lives and our prosperity, our wealth and our pledge and commitment to our nation. These things are, being played with and disrespected. And it's unfortunate because not only does it set us up for a position where like, wow, we can never trust the government, you know. But it also puts us in a position that once we do have trustworthy people in government, it's going to be that much harder for them to work to convince people to do something that is different, because you know, people right now are so desperate, like things are different but not in a good way, and so they're like looking back and reminiscent, like I want things to go back to the way they were before, you know, 2016 when Trump stepped on the scene and started making everything crazy for everyone. We'll never be able to go back. You can't put the genie back in the bottle, you know. Once the egg's cracked, it's done. But what you can do is to move forward, and we need to have a leader that's willing to do the hard and necessary work to clean up the mess. But it's obviously going to take us moving in a different direction than what we're used to, and change is, you know, uncomfortable. You know, Trump is achieving that change through force and violence and fear, you know, and economic disparities and destabilization of systems and intentional shifting of wealth, and impoverishment of other people and disenfranchisement of people. And so, yeah, the whole system is changing, but he's doing it in favoritism of a few, you know, and his personal advantage, while everybody else is put on the hook and then put in this precarious situation to which there's less and less they can do to set things right and to make a way in this world. And so replacing that, you know, negative paradigm with the president that actually cares and wants to make your life better is going to be much harder to convince people to entrust a president, especially one that's coming up with this big grand strategy to shift the paradigm, because people are like going to be afraid of, you know, misplacing trust again. And I think that's probably the worst damage that Trump has really done to the United States of America. The fact that people don't know if they can trust their president anymore. And it's our own fault for voting for somebody that is an untrustworthy person. You know, he's a predator. He's a grifter. He's a liar. He's a cheater. He's a fraud. You know, he's an abuser. And he thinks that he's above the law, and he thinks that there's never any consequences he has to face. And he's been given this position by, you know, the Supreme Court that says that he has diplomatic immunity, whatever, and he can't get in trouble if it's something in terms of, you know, his job. But I argue there are many things that he's done under the title of POTUS that is beyond the, you know, role of being POTUS, and it goes out of his purview of work, and that has intentionally benefited himself, you know, his companies, his family's companies, and his friends' companies. And he's done a lot of damage to America. He's harmed a lot of very innocent people, and he's denied justice for many innocent people by all these crazy people he's pardoned, you know, that caused a lot of harm and were held accountable to it. And he just said, no, you know, that person has won my favor and there's a pardon. And Trump doesn't consider all the consequences of all the people that now no longer have justice. Justice was denied to them. You know, in many cases, Trump says he doesn't even know who he pardoned. So you have to really think about it. Like, how can you instill trust in the American people that, you know, the next person who's going to become president of the United States of America is not going to just be this repeat, you know, continuation of the chaos and the mayhem and the deception and the lies and the cruelty and the rigging systems in the favor of a few and disadvantage everybody else, and, you know, willfully, you know, wielding the power of the office of president in ways that is not conducive to America's best interest or well-being. You know, like, you don't want a continuation of that. But at the same time, the contenders that, especially on the Democratic side, that are trying to, you know, come up in the ranks and assert themselves as, you know, prospects for candidacy in the election, like, yes, they're versed in government, and yes, they're experienced globally, and they have connections and networks, and they've done this before and all these other things, but, you know, it's a lot of the same BS that we've always had before. And we need something that's going to do a revolutionary, evolutionary shift that is going to be able to take us in a far advancement away from the trajectory of the negative outcome consequences of the MAGA, you know, movement in the POTUS 47 regime. We need a huge divergence intentionally in a new direction that deviates from that and allows us, or diverges from that and allows us to align with something that, is constructive and mutually beneficial for everyone. And I just don't see anybody in the Democratic Party having the capacity for vision like that, And so here I am constantly reinforcing my presence here and my voice and reaffirming what I'm working towards and continuously refining the language, but hopefully through my continued, conversation, you hear consistency and constancy. I am just a human like everybody else. I make mistakes. Sometimes I don't have all of the information and I make decisions based off of, the best truth I know at the time. And then sometimes new information comes in and I change my mind. But I do it after a concerted effort to consider all relevant factors, and base it off of truth and facts. And I care to know the truth, and I seek out trustworthy and reliable voices that help to inform me, and I stay true to the fact that I want to work in the best interest of the American people. I want to hear their voices. I want to hear about their care and concerns, and I've devoted myself to do this, but I have to still do it on my own terms because this to me has to be like an adventure that I'm taking on. I want this to be a good thing for me, and I want it to be a good thing for you. I don't want to take you in a trajectory, like come along with me and then it just be this terrible experience. No, I want this to be about something that we can do together and we can experience together that's going to be great. I don't want to impress myself upon you. I want to leave you in wonder about what I mention. I'm not everybody's cup of tea, but I very much appreciate people who take a chance on me. And I understand that I'm different and I'm peculiar, but it's the weird and the wonderful peculiarities about me that really sets me apart from everybody else, because I have authenticity that is unmatched, I have something about me that is different and it's compelling, not because I'm putting on some show or I'm trying to be like performative or that I'm trying to, be something that I'm not or put up a facade. I'm not trying to personify something that I'm not. I'm being myself. I try out all different ways to show up that, I feel is me in the realest sense as I'm trying to portray to people, this is my sensibility now. Right now, this video, totally casual. This is not me trying to be in professional mode. I'm just speaking from my heart, my truth. Given everything that I'm taking on right now and considering and thinking about and caring about, and trying to be as honest as I can of where I am and what I'm working towards, because that sets me up for success. That moves me along the trajectory of synchronicity. It helps me define where I can be of best service to the world. And then I answer that call and I move in that direction with intention to find out what I need to know today that can get me that much closer to be able to, win the trust of the American people, instill confidence in them of who I am as a person, and to know that this isn't about me trying to win, the presidency because it's a thing that I gotta have and I gotta own, I gotta do, it's a title I must have or something like that. No. It's that I must do this because I see so much potential in advancing my work that has, spawned from my heart and my best intentions for the whole entire world, that this really would be something that would just be brilliant. The world would be thankful that we did this together. And I want for that. It's more than hope, Hope is just this thing, I hold it out and something's going to happen. It's going to be right, And it's not just faith, faith, I can't see it yet, but I just know, just around the bend, something's going to happen. And it's not belief, I stick with this, I affirm this is going to happen, It's just knowing that this is right, And so my intention is to constantly reinforce this through my voice as I share it, knowing that, this is a record sent in time. And eventually somebody's going to catch on to what I'm doing, as I put myself more out there with the intention of drawing attention, to what I'm doing. This will be a moment, where I marked a memory, made it whole, and shared with you my thoughts about the here and the now and this perplexing situation that we're in, and how I see a way to move beyond it, and in such a way, like, I understand that I sound like I am coming from a place that can't be taken seriously, because how could I possibly suggest that world peace is possible? Like, that doesn't even make sense. There's so much bad stuff in the world or whatever, and so many bad people. It's like, I get that. This is optimism in action. I refuse to allow myself to go into the cynicism. Like, am I critical? Yes. Do I think consciously? Yes. Do I think logically? Yes. But I also have feeling, and I have heart, and I sense what is right, and I know what is wrong, and I let my conscience be my guide, and I consider the variables that are in relationship to what I know I can do and what I'm trying to bring out in the world, and I consciously look at what other people are experiencing to say, like, does this match? Can it mesh well? Can we work together, in a mutual beneficial way? And that's what I look for. So as I continue to make these videos and share them, hopefully be able to start doing some more short formats, because I know not a lot of people have a lot of time to be able to spend with me here. I'm grateful for your valuable time and attention. But for those that eventually do find this and spend a little time with me, I hope what you hear is this consistency that I keep reinforcing, that is just establishing my voice as a constancy, a trustworthy voice, somebody that is really trying to work out for the best interest of everybody, good outcomes, and engineer for them, and to do so in such a way that where I'm remaining true to myself, and I am expressing myself with all the confidence that I have, but constantly humbling myself to not come off as though I'm cocky. Like, I know who I am, I know where I am, I know what I'm working towards, and I am on my way. And every day I'm building up, success in those trajectories. But I know I can't do this alone. But I know we can do this. And so this is all about finding a way to help to invite you into this, wonderful offering with me. And for you to see opportunity in that, and to want to be able to become involved in it. And at the very least, hopefully give you a sense of, as terrible as things are right now, as confusing and frustrating and, discombobulating and, disorienting, and it doesn't stay this way for long, We are making a difference every day, and we're all doing our own part in our own ways. But there will come a time where our paths converge. And on that day, I hope that you will trust me to help to guide us in a direction that can be good for all of us. That's my hope. And with that, I just say a prayer for everybody who is in a very dark place right now. I pray for healing for everyone who is suffering. I pray for the loss of life to be, ascended in a loving, living memory, and for their families to find healing in their grieving process. And for hopefully they will come into the light of awareness of the hope for a better future, that for everything that has been lost will not be in vain. And just love and light in everybody's hearts, like turn people away from the violence and lean in towards the love. And with that, I'm grateful for your valuable time, attention, and consideration. Until next time, be well.